Travis Strikes Again was a long time coming. It was said very often that there was a change in the way Suda tackled games. You probably heard about how he hasn't directed since No More Heroes 1, or that his name was tacked on projects. The Grasshopper projects were parodies of themselves at this point. This game, however, is back to the basics, with Suda at the helm and with the return of the original tone. His Suda games were always weird, but you can tell that he was pressured into do the weird thing. He mentioned the immense meddling of EA during the production of Shadows of the Damned. As much as I like that game, it basically boiled down to haha penis joke. It also had lots of guns because shooters were all the rage back then. This iteration of No More Heroes feels more in line with something like Killer 7, game with which it crosses over. It's bizarre but in a pseudo way. The characters are contemplative. They talk of their world, themselves, and the concepts of life and death. Games seemingly about nonsense take an entirely new dimension. We're no longer just limited to sexual jokes and to do the weird thing. It's in that context that Travis is plunged into different virtual realities spanning different cult games. It's interesting how it fleshes the world building. The arcade player from Let Die writes magazines about old games in their world. It's also interesting because it's an excuse for Suda to comment on the industry and what he lived through. The second to last level is the most notable because it informs us about Shadows of the Damned, which is well known for having corporate meddling and a difficult development. It comes off as a surprise because this wasn't the game that was supposed to be played inside the story, the same way the game was supposed to be something completely different originally. My only issue with all of this is that at times, the game feels undercooked and strangely paced. The most interesting parts are talking to the bosses after their fights and during the Travis Strikes Back visual novel segment. It felt like there could be more or the distribution could have been better. In the first game, for example, you felt engrossed with the story because things would happen in between fights, but also before and after. A boss felt fleshed out because you had time to talk to them and reflect afterwards. Here you meet and immediately kill them, which is a shame because the character designs are pretty good. The character designer from the original is still the same, yet you barely get time to appreciate these designs. The style in general is pretty good. The top-down view means that things are a little harder to see, so colors and design matter even more. For example, Travis now sports a striking purple jacket that's easy to see from afar and contrasts well with the environment. Enemies have the same treatment with bright colors. The only place where the visual fails is in the repetition of the locations. They're fine and are quite striking, but they tend to repeat a little too much. That dojo area might be nice, and so was the nice quiet neighborhood, but seeing the same tile set over and over again gets tiring. Although there is repetition, in the gameplay department it usually comes down to levels outstaying their welcome. The game is actually surprisingly addictive. The base is more or less the same, light and heavy attack with wrestling moves. The difference is that you hold down the button for light, and wrestling is limited to finishers and boss fights. Despite this, the fighting flows really well. It comes down to the power-ups that are available to the player. You end up genuinely having to make smart choices during moments of action. I did wish that there wasn't a cooldown to them. It doesn't work well outside of role-playing games. The pacing being much faster, that type of restriction doesn't lend itself well to it. It especially feels bad when you equip a skill for the first time and wait for a long cooldown only to realize that the skill you selected just plain sucks. Overall, the gameplay is quite entertaining, even though it gets a bit grating in the end and post-game. In the late game, levels got especially long, and I would get stun-locked to death by hard-to-see attacks. It would really hammer home the fact that you don't have invincibility frames. What happened to mashing a button to get up and push away enemies? Waves got longer and adversaries more numerous, and the DLC only made it worse. It also increased difficulty, which really sheds a light on the flaws of the game. Speaking of DLC, the story is quite unfinished. I got the complete edition, but otherwise, if you had played the normal release, the game would end on a pretty anticlimactic note. After all those feelings shared about the development of games, feeling old, left aside, poorly understood, and putting effort into something that amounts to nothing, well, it amounts to nothing. The wish of Batman gets granted and his storyline becomes an afterthought. And Travis, on the other hand, you wonder what was the point of his adventure after all. The spin-off aspect is fine, but this just feels like a setup for the, at the time, long-awaited No More Heroes 3. Travis Strikes Again is definitely a game worth finishing. It's not that long and doesn't feel long. God knows some short games can give you quite the hardship. However, I'm not sure if this is something I'll replay often. Maybe once or twice, maybe in co-op, no more. The first two titles had a bigger enjoyment factor. It's a recommended for me. The 7 out of 10 you see everywhere fits this game. It's not over nor underrated. It just fits right.